Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming back from lunch. Hope you guys have been enjoying the food and all the organization put together by our amazing organization team. It's my pleasure right now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Veronica Yan. She's an assistant professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. Bridging cognitive, social, and educational perspectives, Dr. Yan's research explores how we can empower people to become motivated and effectively self-regulated learners. Dr. Yan is presently focused on examining the mechanisms underlying desirably difficult strategies and the motivational mindsets that encourage learners to not just study harder, but to study smarter. Her own educational background has spanned 3 continents. She studied at an international school in Hong Kong before heading to the University of Cambridge for undergraduate studies in England, and then she completed her doctoral studies and postdoctoral training in California in the US at UCLA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Veronica Yan.
Thank you so much, Joe. Quick question, I've got pieces of paper everywhere. Does everyone have at least one copy of that piece of paper? It says Rating the Properties of Words. So put your hands up if you don't have a piece of paper, and then there should be a stack in the room somewhere near you of spares floating around. All right, I know you've heard a lot of really interesting things. You're maybe a little bit full from all that delicious food from lunch. So the first thing we're going to do is a little activity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a series of 20 words. And what I want you to do is to look at that question at the top of your paper and answer yes or no for each word. So I've already written down for you those nice 20 little blanks. Write Y for S and N for no. Now the words are going to go by quite quickly. They're going to go at a rate of about 3 seconds per word. So, look at the word, write down Y or N, look back up again. All right? The slide corners are numbered. So right now it says 0. It's going to change, say 1 through 20, so you know where you are if you get lost. Okay, are we all ready? Yes. How does this work? All right, good job. That wasn't too difficult. Nice, easy task right after lunch. So, I'm an educational psychologist, which means I study how we learn and what we can do about that to improving learning and instruction. Now, how many people here have learned anything in their lives? How many of us have been students? How many of us have been teachers? Now, how many of us have learned how to learn? I went through school pretty successfully. I was that kid in class who got good grades. This is me. Oh, no, it's not right. This is me over 20 years ago. But that kid, I had parents who really valued education. I'm Asian. You needed to get A's for everything. But what did my parents know about learning how to learn? As a kid, the messages that I heard were, go study, turn off the TV and go do your homework. Don't stop playing games, get off the phone, go study. Study, study, study. My parents didn't say, go read a cognitive psychology paper on learning sciences. My parents didn't say, space your studying, not mass, don't mass it. They didn't say interleave, not block. They didn't say test yourself instead of reread. And that's the sort of situation that the most of us grow up in. We've spent our entire lives being professional learners. And yet, very little of the actual messages that we hear are about how we learn. In some cases, it's almost assumed that we would just naturally do it. I just finished my first year as an assistant professor, and what I think a lot of us in this room probably also have realized is that as professors, we get zero to little training on how to teach. We get our jobs by virtue of being experts in learning, having learned what we learn, and we're somehow expected to just teach. So whether I was, that little kid or as a professor, in none of these situations have I actually received any training on how to teach aside from the research that I do myself. And in part, it's because learning is oftentimes considered so obvious because we've been doing it our whole lives. And yet what I'm hopefully going to present to you today is all these ways in which it's counterintuitive. Okay, now turn that piece of paper on its back and write down all the words you can remember.
In order?
Doesn't have to be in order. It can be in any order you like. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do so. There are 20 words, just a hint. Don't cheat. I see you. Professor Norman, you should be ashamed. Okay, we about done? Have we exhausted what we think we can remember? So here were the words. So just quickly score yourselves. Count up how many words did you recall, and write that number on your piece of paper. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people on this side of the room to shout out their numbers. 2, 1, 3, 3, 2, 7, 4, 5, 6, 1. Okay, now people on this side of the room, how many did you get? 7, 10, 8, 4, 9, 14. Wow, anyone beat 14? Okay, first off, what have we noticed about the two halves of the room? This side did better than this side. Why might that be so? Is it because I was standing closer to this side and they felt scared by my presence and something about that fear? Is it because we have the learning scientists here and they've dragged their average up? So let's see. Joe helped you cheat? Let's see. Faria, can you read the question at the top of your paper? Does the word denote a living thing? Now, Michelle, can you read out the question at the top of your piece of paper?
Is the third letter a vowel?
Is the third letter a vowel? How many people here expected a memory test on those words? Handful of people who've taken intro psych, perhaps? Now, what we see is there's a huge difference. Even though the majority of people did not expect to be tested, you were not looking at the words intending to memorize them. Just by virtue of changing the way you encode and process the words, there's a huge difference in how much you can recall. And I think this is a point that's been repeated a few times today by both Yana yesterday and Megan today. The point is it's not necessarily about how much you want to learn, but what's super important is that the processes you engage during learning make a large, large difference on your outcomes. Now, in this study that was done in 1975, they had some people who were in the same condition as you, where they didn't know to expect a memory test. Now, other people, before they were asked to rate the properties of words, they knew that they were going to be tested. So they were actually told to prepare for a test. The few psychologists in here, or people who've taken interest psych in here, may have known that a memory test was coming. Now, does that intentional motivation of trying to learn the words, does that make a large difference? Not that much. So what we see here is that, yes, motivation is important. You have to get your students into the seats and want to learn in the first place. But once they get here, what you do with the information, how you process information, how you teach information, makes a huge difference. So let's use an analogy for learning. Let's think about going to the gym. Let's say you want to get fit, you want to get strong. Now, obviously, you have to be motivated. You have to want that in the first place to get your butt to the gym. But once you get to the gym, you're faced with a scene that looks something like this. And I have no idea how to use any of this machinery. If I don't know how to use the tools available to me, I'm not going to get as much out of my workout as if I do know how to use the tools available to me. I also have to know how my body works, how to strengthen my muscles. I have to know that I have to push myself, I have to get my heart rate up, I have to feel that pain. If I want to do strength training, it's bigger weights, lower reps. I have to know how to strengthen my body, and that's the same thing goes for learning. You have to know how to use the tools available to you, but you also have to know how your mind works. You have to know how memory, learning, forgetting, how all of these things work. So how do we learn? And this is a question that I've asked many, many students, and I've asked many, many teachers throughout the years. And when I ask the students, let's say, how do you learn? Let's say you have a test coming up next week. What do you do? What do you think are the most common responses? Read and reread. Sometimes it's reading for the first time, right? So if you're lucky, they'll say rereading. So there's rereading. What else? Make study notes. They might look at their notes. They might highlight and underline things. There's a lot of repetition going on. Maybe they'll summarize and make outlines with their notes. I ask students, do you ever test yourself? They say, yeah, of course I do. When do you test yourself? Well, after I study. I have to study to learn, and then I test myself to see what I've learned. And if they have multiple exams they have to prepare for, if there are multiple modules within a course, they say, I'm going to focus on one thing at a time. Tuesday, I'm going to study biology and spend the whole day on it. Wednesday, I'm going to study organic chemistry, so spend one whole day on it. They do one thing at a time. And these things, different students say different things, but it almost doesn't matter what they say because there's one underlying assumption that goes behind everything that they're saying. Whatever it is that they come up with, they say, I need to study in this way because this will make learning easy. There's one common assumption is that in order to learn effectively, learning has to come easy. Now, is this really the case? How do we know when something is learned? I think a lot of us has had the experience, whether it's ourselves or a student coming into our office, where they say, I thought I knew it. And then comes the test, and suddenly I've forgotten it. And some students say, well, that's because I'm really bad at taking tests. I'm good at learning, but I'm really bad at taking tests. Or maybe you're a teacher and you quiz your students immediately after the lecture and they get everything correct and you think, yes, I'm a fantastic teacher. 2 days later, they come back to class again, you ask them the same question at the beginning and suddenly no one got it. And then that's the point where we sit and say, wow, our students have forgotten a lot. Not that I'm a bad teacher, but wow, my students just forget really quickly. So how do we know when information is learned if these indications of can I recall it now don't necessarily map onto can I recall it later? Now, in order to really understand why these different things happen, we have to go back to thinking about some of these underlying fundamental dynamics of how memory works. A lot of the time, people think about memory and learning as if it were on a single spectrum, from not at all learned to very, very well learned. But in fact, memory can be indexed along two different measures. One is storage strength, and the other one is retrieval strength. Now, another word for storage strength is, or another word for retrieval strength is performance. Can I recall something right now? Can I perform in the moment when I'm directly asked? That's retrieval strength. It's your ability to recall something in the moment. And we're going to contrast that with storage strength, which is real learning. Have I actually learned something well enough that it's embedded into these semantic knowledge networks in my mind so that I can actually retrieve it at some other time? So I can recall it for the long term. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples as to how these things are different. So we can carve up the space into 4 quadrants, and we can think about low retrieval strength, low storage strength, low retrieval strength, high storage strength, high, high, and high, low. Now, what are some examples? I guess I flashed that quickly. Does anyone have any ideas as to what might be something that is high retrieval strength or high storage strength? Something that you can recall very easily now and also is very well learned.
My phone number.
Good reading, yes, but also maybe you just know it. My phone number. Oh, you didn't? Fantastic. Your phone number is something that you can recall very well and is something that's very well learned because you've had to repeat it many, many times over the years. Yes?
Song lyrics?
Song lyrics, depending on the song, right?
Well, if you hear like a top 40 song that you hear
Constantly.
constantly and then it,
You hear it every day on the radio, you sing along to it because it's super annoyingly catchy. That is now going to be something that's high storage strength, high retrieval strength. What's an example of something that would be low storage strength, low retrieval strength? Something that's the parking space you were in 2 days ago. You only had to remember it for that one time when you came back to your car, and because it happened several days ago and you've had to park in the similar parking lot over the last couple of days, it's actually really hard to recall right now, and it's not well learned at all. Yes?
a stranger's name, you meet someone once,
A stranger's name, absolutely.
name, and then
And everyone, I don't know why we find this also embarrassing when it happens to everyone, that you can't remember a new person's name. You oftentimes hear the name at the introduction before you've had time to really encode anything or think about, I need to remember this. And then they talk about other things and you completely forget the name. That's low retrieval strength because you can't recall it, and it's low storage strength because it was never well learned. Now, how about in the other quadrants? What would be something that is high retrieval strength but low storage strength?
Something a student just crammed?
Something a student just crammed. They just saw it, it's fresh on their mind, but because they crammed it, they didn't learn it very well, there's low storage strength. Absolutely. Now, how about low retrieval strength, high storage strength? So we're talking about this upper left. Something that's very, very well learned, but you can't actually recall it right now. A traumatic incident might be something that, because you've really tried not to recall it, maybe it's not very retrievable perhaps, but then high storage because it keeps coming back and recurring flashbacks perhaps. And the lady in red? How to ride a bike? What would that be? Which quadrant? High and high, because if you've learned it and you've learned it well, you can just do it. Yep.
I mix up my kids' names all the time.
You mix up your kids' names all the time. Oh, and so does the gentleman next to you. So yeah, this would be a case perhaps, I would say also there's probably some interference going on there, but yeah, your inability to retrieve something at the moment, maybe because there's interference, that would be lower retrieval strength, but they obviously are very well learned because these are your kids' names. Any other?
How to tie a tie?
How to tie a tie. Maybe you did this a lot when you were in school. I had school uniform growing up, so I can tie a full Windsor knot and a half Windsor knot like no one else's business. But I haven't had to do it in a long time, so maybe I'd be very rusty. Here are the examples that I came up with. So your current phone number versus your childhood phone number. Maybe it's been a really, really long time since you used it, but because your parents drilled that number into you for safety's sake, if you do see the number, it'll come rushing back at you very quickly. So that would be something that has high storage strength. Or apparently Jeff can remember. Or my hotel room number this weekend. I know what room I'm staying in. I need it right now. It's high retrieval strength, but I'm going to forget it by the time I have my next trip. Okay, so let's say you have these 4 pieces of information, and you're going to study each one again. What happens to storage strength and retrieval strength? If I repeat my hotel room number again, right now, because it's already on my mind, it doesn't have very far to go in terms of retrieval strength. But because it's already fresh on my mind, I can say the room number over and over again, and I'm not going to remember that much more. So it's going to get very little gain in terms of storage strength. My current phone number as well, I know it really well. I'm kind of at ceiling. Additional repetition after I've already repeated my phone number about 15 million times is not going to do all that much. And because it's high retrieval strength, it's already high on my mind, it's not going to come flooding back because it's already there. My childhood phone number, however, if you see your child, unless you're Jeff and you already know it, if you're reminded of a number you haven't used in a long time, something that's going to come rushing back at you, it's going to get this huge boost in retrieval strength. It's going to come back fresh in your mind. But because it's already very well learned, it's not that big of a boost, again, in terms of storage strength. So if storage strength is about learning, what does this mean? This means you really have to be down in this bottom left quadrant in order to get big boosts in storage strength. If you take something that you didn't really know very well yet, so there's a lot left to learn, and it's not fresh on your mind, this is the place where you can make the biggest boosts in learning. So I'm going to let this kind of sit with you for a little bit. We're going to come back to it after a little retrieval practice break. Okay, retrieval practice. On the piece of paper in front of you, write down, what is retrieval strength? You done? All right, now I want you to think about these 4 quadrants and tell me where you think that question just landed you. A, B, C, or D? The answer to what is retrieval strength? Does it fall in quadrant A, B, C, or D? Now, does someone have the answer to the question, what is retrieval strength? Yes?
Performance in the moment.
Performance in the moment, absolutely. Or you might have written, how easily I can recall something right now. You might have just written performance. Now, what quadrant do we think? Hands up for quadrant A. Hands up for quadrant B, C, and D. Now, why? So someone who said D, why do you think it's D? I'm going to pick on you in the front.
We just learned it.
You just learned it. You just heard it.
So it's high in retrieval strength.
So it's high in retrieval strength.
Pretty well versed in retrieval strength. And all of this stuff is might be low in terms of
Yeah, so assuming you don't actually already know about retrieval strength and storage strength, this should be pretty new information. It should be low storage strength for you. But because I literally just told you about it and you were staring at the slide with the word retrieval strength and performance on it, this should be high in retrieval strength. It should be in quadrant D. See what I'm doing here? Okay, let's try another question. What are your main takeaway points from Dr. Wayman's X-Reality and the Concord Fallacy in Education talk this morning? All you have to do is write 1 or 2 points, whatever was your takeaway from it. All right, do we want, does anyone want to offer their answer? Yes, in the back.
VR is better than nothing.
What was it? VR is better than nothing. Yep. Very good. Anyone else? Yep. Expensive and fancy doesn't necessarily mean better. Absolutely. Now, which quadrant would you put that piece of knowledge in? All right, let's put hands up for A, hands up for B, hands up for C, hands up for D. Oh, there's no consensus. Does someone who said C want to share their answer? Yeah.
Well, for me, because I teach mathematics, the importance of the physical object in student performance really some deep, resonate with some stuff that I want to do. It's something I very much know I'm going to be keeping.
So because it was really relevant to something that you teach, you could see how it'd be related to what you'd want to do. So why would that be low retrieval strength?
Oh, so I said B.
Oh, you said B, sorry. Okay, so why is it high retrieval strength? Were you thinking about it over lunch?
Yeah.
And recently? So maybe after the talk, you were still thinking about it, so it was still high and fresh on your mind, so maybe it's high retrieval strength. High storage strength, is it something that you'd already learned about in the past?
Yes, but it hadn't been so clearly quantified and laid bare.
So it was something that you'd thought about before. Yeah, it's all very relative. Yes. What did you say? You said B? Because of reference to the Concord fallacy. So it drew on something that you were already very familiar with.
So I teach innovation, and so some cost is something that you want to ignore. And so it was a very relevant point to the whole making the whole.
So the Concord fallacy, especially for you, was something that was high storage strength. And maybe because if you've been thinking about it, it's high retrieval strength. Anyone else? Yes, what did you say?
I voted A. I said it was low retrieval strength because I couldn't, for the life of me, remember anything word for word, but high in the sense that, high storage strength in the sense that I feel like I could take away those lessons in the future, even though I hadn't learned it before.
So here you said, it was in the moment when I asked you to write down what are your main takeaway points, it can be a little bit difficult to think back, right? Who had to actually think for a little bit to be able to bring it to mind? What were the main points? You had to kind of run through things. If you had to think about it for a moment and had to struggle to bring it back, that means it's actually relatively low retrieval strength in that moment. So that would put you at either A or C. And if something is really, really well learned and you've known it, then that would be higher storage strength. And if something that's relatively new to you, that would be lower retrieval strength. And of course, everything's relative, so what you consider better learned and what you consider worse learned, not as well learned, would differ depending on what you were thinking here. But this is how we can start to tease apart retrieval strength and storage strength. If something's difficult to recall for you in the moment, rather than being fresh on your mind, because if it's fresh on your mind, there's no recall needed. It's already right there. So let's go back to this idea of making learning easy. A lot of students have told me, if I can only find the right way to study, if I can only figure out my learning style, learning will come easy. But what this model of memory indicates is that if something feels easy, maybe it's because you're dealing with the space up here. You already know it. There's high storage strength. And if you already know it, there's not much more extra learning that can be gained from another single exposure. Or maybe it feels easy because you're dealing with this space. It's fresh on your mind. You literally just saw it. You literally just heard about it. In which case, if it feels easy and there's high retrieval strength, you're also not putting yourself in this space that is the maximally beneficial for learning. So that means that when learning feels easy, either way, whether it's because it's high storage strength or high retrieval strength, you aren't maximizing your learning. Now, how does this apply to real study in the classroom, to a student's actual learning behaviors? Let's try and think about studying to prepare for a test. So let's say I crack open my book for the first time, because I'm that student who never reads until the exam. I study. and I think to myself, okay, you know what, this is a really difficult chapter, I haven't quite got it, so I'm going to study it again. And as I'm studying it again, I'm thinking to myself, man, this feels a lot more familiar. I feel like I'm on a roll in my learning, I feel like I'm really getting it. It feels easy at this point here. Alternatively, I could study this chapter and wait a little bit of time, maybe go watch something on Netflix or go make myself a meal and come back to study the chapter again a second time. Now, at the second time, what does it feel like? It feels more difficult. I'm suddenly aware that in this time that's passed between my first and second reading, I've forgotten some of the information. And it may actually be a little bit frustrating for the student down here at the second spaced out study, because you think to yourself, I'm aware that I've forgotten some stuff, and I feel like I'm having to go back over old ground rather than learning new things. However, as we've heard over the last couple of days, we know that spacing is really, really good for learning, because in allowing yourself that time to forget the material, to step back and let that material go away from the front of your mind, you're actually lowering retrieval strength, so that what happens at the second restudy, you can actually engage more effective retrieval processes studying. You're actually learning more, getting more out of the second study over here than you are over here. What this means is that allowing yourself to forget is actually what allows you to learn. Forgetting is not the opposite of learning. Forgetting is actually incredibly central to the process of learning. And in this example, I said, study and then study again. But another way that we can boost this learning even higher is, instead of studying again, do retrieval practice. Test yourself. Because retrieving something, it's not like checking a book out from the library. You don't take a book out, a memory out, and put it back in the exact same way. Every time you retrieve a memory, it gets put back stronger than it was before. Whatever you retrieve, you strengthen. So retrieval is, in and of itself, a memory modifier. And this is the direct effects of testing that Yana and Megan have been talking about over the last couple of days. The reason why testing and retrieving information is good for you is because that very act of recalling something, bringing something to mind, will help you learn that information better than if you just passively studied it. And we can combine spacing and retrieval, as Jessica mentioned in her data bliss, the successive relearning. Because if you think about this situation where you study something and then you immediately test yourself on it, or you immediately test your students on it, yes, of course they're going to get it correct. Of course you're going to say retrieval strength is performance, because you literally just gave your students the answers, and I literally just gave you the answers. That act of testing is good. It's going to be better than just restudying, but it's going to actually have fairly small effects on learning unless you allow for some sort of forgetting in between. So now, having thought back, having spent a few hours in between my talk and Dr. Wainman's talk this morning, having that spacing before then you test yourself again, that's going to be much, much better for learning. So these are two of the most robust findings from the cognitive psychology literature, and here are kind of two review papers, one for spacing and one for retrieval practice. Now, I'm not going to spend too much on this because you've already heard so much about retrieval practice this symposium. So was there anyone else who wanted to share their response about what they got from Dr. Wainman's talk? Were there any other main takeaways? Nope? Okay, we'll move it onwards. Now, a lot of you might be thinking that a lot of this vocabulary learning stuff is not quite similar to the stuff that you have to teach. And it's true that in cognitive psychology, what we oftentimes do is we want to go back to basics. So Megan talked about, starting from the lab and moving into the classroom. We do oftentimes want to start with the basics, but then that leaves questions about what about things that go beyond memory? What if we have to teach our students how to learn concepts? So for example, conceptual learning or inductive learning is about studying from a set of examples and being able to induce a set of general rules so that when you see a new example of something, you can apply it in that new situation. So here with these chest x-rays, let's say you're medical students, the x-rays that you study in your medical textbook are not going to be the same set of x-rays that walk into your office when you're a practicing doctor. Like, they're not going to be the same patient. You're going to have to learn how to induce rules that you can apply. And let's say you have to learn multiple things. As a medical student, you have to learn how to read chest x-rays for fractures, for tumors, for other anomalies, to just look for what's normal, and every person's normal looks different from every other person's normal. So maybe if you're trying to do multiple things, it might make sense to immerse students in one lesson so that they can fully understand it before moving on to the next. So that's a very common intuition. That's kind of the basis of our entire educational system. We do one thing at a time before moving on. So let's try another little demo. This is a Gentoo penguin. This is another Gentoo. This is a Gentoo. And this is a Gentoo. Now I'm going to test you. Which one's a Gentoo? Pointing top left. Is everyone pointing top left? Anyone pointing other pictures? No? Now, you've never seen this picture of a Gentoo before. How did you know that's a Gentoo? The little white stripe over the head, the earmuff, eye, whatever. And maybe you noticed that because I showed you 4 pictures of Gentoos consecutively, and because I showed you Gentoo after Gentoo after Gentoo, you're able to see the commonalities that tie the Gentoo penguin together. Whereas what if I had mixed up the Gentoo penguin with a bunch of other different penguins? Maybe by this time you get to the next Gentoo penguin, it's really hard to think back to what that first one looked like. It can feel very, very confusing. So, and maybe, this is a skeptical baby meme, in case you didn't know. Maybe spacing things out and spreading things out isn't always such a good thing. And in fact, an eminent cognitive psychologist once said, spacing is the friend of recall, but the enemy of induction. I think this was personal communication back in the 80s. So let's now fast forward to 2008. Now in my PhD lab, before I was a doctoral student actually, there was a study. Imagine that you are an art student and you have to learn the painting styles of 12 different artists. So everyone, I'm going to show you a little bit of a demo so you kind of know what it feels like to be a participant in this study. Now, you're going to see paintings by 12 different artists. In the experiment, people saw 6 paintings by each artist. I'm not going to show you 72 paintings today. Now, these paintings by these different artists, they could be sequenced in, there are many different ways, but let's pick 2 of the extremes. We can show you the paintings by each artist, one artist at a time, and we call this blocked practice, block studying, because we're blocking by artist. And this is what it would look like. Painting by Lewis, followed by another one. You'll notice they actually go by quite quickly. By the 3rd or the 4th painting, maybe you're starting to get a sense of Lewis's style. He's got the thick brush strokes, the big, bold colors. All right, does everyone think they got Lewis? Good? Kind of? Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I can show you the paintings by all the different artists all mixed up. And this is what that would look like. Pisani, Wexler, Schlorf, Stratulat. Maybe by the 4th or the 5th one, it's starting to get a little confusing. It's starting to be hard to keep track. Maybe by the time you come to a second painting by the first previously seen artist, it's a little hard to think back to what that former one looked like. Now, on the final test, people were shown new paintings they've never seen before, and they had to say which of those studied artists painted it. In some of these experiments, what we actually do is we actually even give feedback to the students trial by trial so they know when they're correct or incorrect. At the very end, we ask students, what do you think helped you learn the styles better? Seeing them one at a time, blocked, having them all mixed up, interleaved, or were they about the same? Now, you guys just saw a bit of a demo. You kind of went through what the students went through. What do you think most people said helped them? Blocked. The majority of people said, 1 at a time helped me learn better. However, because every person had half of the artist blocked and half the artist interleaved, you can see for which set they learned better. In terms of how they actually did, the results go completely the opposite way. Even though blocking feels easier, that feeling is an illusion of learning. It's misleading. In fact, interleaving leads to better learning. This is just the proportion of people who did better on the interleave set than the block set, but we can actually look at their performance score. So of all the artists that were interleaved, what percentage of those paintings were classified correctly? Of all the blocked artist paintings, what percentage of those were categorized correctly? And it's not even close. If you're sitting in a class and it's a difference between 35% and 61%, that's a 2.5 letter grade difference. So it's not that there was a tiny difference and a little bump, and so people couldn't really tell which one was better. They were given feedback, mind you, and yet 72% of people said that blocking was better. This doesn't just work for these very perceptual materials. We had someone here earlier asking about, teaching math. So this is a study that was conducted by Taylor and Rohrer down in the University of South Florida. And they went into grade school classrooms, and they taught students how to calculate the number of faces, edges, corners, and angles of different polygons. Now, in one condition, they taught it in the standard way you would learn something in school. You learn about faces, how to calculate the number of faces, practice a bunch, learn edges, practice a bunch, learn angles, practice a bunch, learn corners, practice a bunch. That's the block condition. And the other condition, they had students learn all 4 at the same time and then practice the same number of practice problems, but all mixed up. So that's interleaved. If we just look at how students performed on these practice questions, those who studied and practiced these problems blocked did a lot better than those who practiced the problems interleaved on the practice questions. So by the last practice questions, the blockers were getting 100%. By the last practice questions, the interleavers were getting only 81%. So if I stop the class here, if I stop the experiment here, what does it look like is better for learning? It looks like blocked is better. You ask the students what's better. They'd say blocking's better, I'm doing better. You ask the teacher what's better. Well, blocking's clearly better because my students are getting 100%. Let's bring these students back. I can't remember if this was 2 days or 24 hours. Either way, it's a very short time. Let's bring these kids back, I think it was 2 days later, and give them a test on all 4. Those who were getting 100% at each one of these questions correct by the end of the practice, it turns out all they were doing was plugging and playing. They didn't have to think through these practice problems. They didn't have to learn how to discriminate between the different types of problems. So even though they got 100%, that 100% does not reflect real learning. 38% is well below failing by any measure. On the other hand, these students who had to intermix or interleave the practice problems of different question types, they had to constantly, a given formula was constantly being put out of their mind, and they had to retrieve that repeatedly. In juxtaposing the different types of problems, they were able to learn how to discriminate between them, so that on this final test, when you have to have them do all of the different questions, they know which is the formula they have to retrieve. So they practice retrieval, they practice discrimination, they practice all these processes during interleave practice that they need for when they are actually getting tested. And if you think about learning for life, life doesn't come at you blocked. If you're that doctor now, like practicing GP in your office, you don't have your assistant tell you, well, today all the patients you're going to be seeing are going to have heart attacks, and tomorrow all of them will have liver cancer. Life comes at you interleaved. So, and here, what we're showing is that life is also learned interleaved. Now, the interleaving benefit is also very robust. So Faria and I had a question is, what does interleaving help everyone? What if you have lower working memory capacity and it might be too hard to keep all these different things in mind? Now, mind you, one limitation is that this was studied on college students, who are actually, a very high-performing set of the population usually. So our working memory measure, there may be some kind of range limitations to it. But we tested whether people benefited from interleaving more or less, depending on if they were low working memory or high working memory capacity. And we tested this for 2 different types of materials. So we used the paintings that you saw before. And what we find is that on the bottom is people's score on the working memory task, the O-span. So here is the lower working memory, here's higher working memory. What we see here is that, yes, people with low working memory generally do worse than people with high working memory, but overall, there's an interleaving benefit, and that benefit is the same size regardless of which end of the spectrum you're on. And when we did this with teaching students how to recognize what non-parametric statistic tests to use for different types of research designs, we then got a very similar finding as well. Here we have a bit of a ceiling effect, so I imagine that should go up. But what you're seeing here is first of all, the low working memory students are not being harmed. If anything, what it's actually doing is bringing the low working memory performance actually closer to the high working memory. So here we're actually showing that interleaving potentially, mind you there's ceiling effects, could potentially attenuate that difference between low working memory students and high working memory students. And it's been shown across the lifespan in children as young as 5 and older adults as old as 80s. It's been shown with other sorts of visual materials, like learning how to classify different types of birds, different types of butterflies. It's been shown with more cognitive school-type concepts, like learning how to calculate the volume of different shapes, learning organic chemistry molecules. Dr. Norman has a paper showing that interleaving helps with learning of how to read ECG. It's also been shown with motor skills, from fine motor skills like learning how to tie different types of knots and playing different piano songs, as well as bigger motor movements such as learning how to swing a baseball bat to different types of pitches. The interleaving effect is very general, very robust across all of these different things. But it is something that is so counterintuitive. People don't like this, and people, when they go through it, they think there's no way I could be learning. There is something, however, that might save that. So earlier today, we heard Mira, present a little data blitz on hybrid schedules of learning. What if we could combine both the benefits? Because there is also evidence to show that blocking helps you learn the commonalities better. So if that's really important, then you want to block for the learning of the commonalities. And interleaving is really good for drawing attention to the differences. My speculation is that interleaving is not only good for drawing attention to the differences, but then for memorizing, because once you've learned what the rules are, then you can space. But perhaps, really, we can combine blocking and interleaving to get the best of both worlds. And what I did was I used these painting stimuli again, and here's the blocked versus interleave, and we replicate the basic effect that interleaving leads to better learning than blocking. But we can also now design lots of different types of hybrid schedules. So remember, blocking and interleaving, all they represent are 2 ends of a spectrum. You can actually do lots of different combinations in the middle. So I had mini blocks, which were sets of 3, AAA, BBB, CCC, before then coming back again, AA, BBB, CCC. Or you can go block to interleave, so start off with several in a row before then starting to mix things up. Or backwards, mix things up and then do one thing at a time. And what I find is that interleave to blocked was not very good, but these other 2 hybrid schedules, they weren't better than pure interleaving, but they were not significantly different. So they led to as good learning. And the other wonderful part of the story is that people loved these. If you ask people what's better for learning, they'll say, oh, of course, these are really good for learning. So here's a case where if you're going to be in the classroom trying to teach your students, you may want to use some combination of blocking and interleaving, some sort of hybrid schedule. It won't hurt the learning, while also getting students to enjoy it better. Now, the interleaving effect, there is still a lot of research going on about what exactly are the boundary conditions, how exactly does it work. It's been shown to be robust in many different ways. We're just trying to finesse our understanding of it. One of my colleagues, so I did this again with studying more examples, so the same thing. One of my colleagues looked at a very different type of material. Rather than these kind of very artsy, there's not really any rule, you have to just get the gist sense of the paintings. He looked at what if you have rule-based categories? And he designed, or someone designed these cartoon fish, and these fish were either really easy to learn because all the most salient features were their defining features. So this is all one type of fish. It's this triangular shape, it's green with stripes. Or they were fish where they were more difficult to learn because the salient features were not diagnostic. It was the fact that they have this dot here and this lower fin here. And I think, yeah, it was because they had the dot and this lower fin that were different, that defined this category. So here we have a situation where it's really easy to see the commonalities. It's really difficult to see the commonalities. Where it's really easy to see the commonalities, interleaving was better, but where it was really difficult to see the commonalities, blocking was better. He also, however, ran a hybrid schedule, blocked to interleaved, and it didn't matter if you were dealing with the easier fish or the harder fish, the hybrid schedule was always better. So that would be another reason why hybrid schedules may be a very good thing to use in your classes. But the general idea is because interleaving is so counterintuitive, what we really, really want to do is introduce interleaving much, much sooner than we naturally would. Does that make sense? I think a lot of people may leave interleaving to when I do practice tests, but we know now that interleaving is so useful for learning in and of itself that you don't want to waste all your time blocking. You really want to bring interleaving in sooner. So what are effective study strategies? Desirable difficulties. Spacing, interleaving, retrieval practice, we've heard all of these different things. Except the problem is these things are hard. Desirable difficulties are things that are good for learning, but because they introduce challenge, they make you feel like you're learning slower, they're difficult. And because they're difficult, people tend not to like them. Now here's just a smattering of different experiments. From left to right on the x-axis is worse to better learning manipulation. In these very same studies, we can ask people what do you think was better for your own learning? And in each of these situations, what we find is that people's predictions run exactly counter to the actual reality of their learning. We don't know what's good for our own learning. Now I'm going to have to try to speed through. We find this time and time again. And there's this big difference between performance, current retrieval strength, and long-term learning. Here is an example of study versus test. Here's an example of cramming or massing versus spacing. Here's an example of blocking versus interleaving. On immediate tests or during practice, what we tend to find is studying is better, massing is better, and blocking is better. On final tests, however, we find that it completely flips around. And the problem as students and as teachers is that we oftentimes base what we think is good for learning on acquisition and performance, rather than on final test and learning. So I'm going to skip through this. Miss Wormwood? Yes, Calvin? You can present the material, but you can't make me care. Let's go back to that analogy in the gym. When you're there on the treadmill and you're starting to sweat and you're starting to pant and your face is getting red, your legs are starting to hurt, you look down at the time and it's only 3 minutes have elapsed. What do you say to yourself? In the gym, it doesn't feel comfortable, it feels difficult because I can't even get past 3 minutes of running, but you say to yourself, no pain, no gain. In the classroom, however, we don't think about that. In the classroom, when something's difficult, we think, well, this is just not possible for me. It's not working for me, I can't do it. But what all of cognitive psychology literature and learning sciences tells us is that difficulty is central to the very process of learning. It's very important for learning. So what we should be doing is, instead of thinking make learning easy, we should import what we already think about in the gym into the classroom and think no pain, no gain. All right, thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, and I'll pass this microphone around to the questioners. Okay.
I could have yelled. So I have 2 kids in the public school system, and when I think of interleaving, I think of the frustrated, like, I can't do this. And so I guess the hybrid schedule would at least keep them a little bit motivated, but how do you overcome the lack of motivation if they think, I'm frustrated and I can't do this, and they just shut down?
It's really interesting because when you think about kids, before they start school, the first 5 years of their life, everything is interleaved, and there's a huge joy in the learning they have there. You know, when your kids, before they start school, they already learn the animals, they know what a cat is, they know what a dog is, but it's not that you've lined up every neighborhood cat and gone cat, 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 dog, 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 dog. Life comes at them interleaved, so they're already interleaving, and that's a natural part. There's something that happens when we stick kids into school that suddenly we're training them out of what are the good ways to learn. So I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question. I don't know about with younger kids. I do know that with undergraduate students, when you teach them why, so when you change the structure of your teaching and you explain to them why you're doing that, a lot of them are actually very receptive. So it no longer feels like you're making them jump through hoops, but they can understand that this is part of why, and you're actually doing a lot to help them learn.
Would you suggest from this that we kind of stop the whole unit thing and just start the first day with, here's the final exam, let's try it?
So should we stop the whole unit thing? No, I don't think so. So I think there is going to be a balance. First of all, let's start with the final exam. I guess that is actually not necessarily a bad thing. We do know that there's research on pre-testing, and Megan alluded to it a little bit in terms of indirect effects. Pre-testing and knowing what's coming up, activating your prior knowledge actually helps people learn more when you subsequently teach them. But it doesn't mean that we should get rid of the unit system. What it means is that we should be having cumulative exams, cumulative quizzes, that we should be building assignments and projects and practice homework problems in ways that aren't just unitized, in ways that draw and help people integrate, retrieve, space, etc.
Do you think that, like, for you, maybe any student actually learning or studying the content out of the order that it was taught would be beneficial, like interleaved, I guess?
I would definitely say study out of order. I think one of the problems of studying in a very strict order is that oftentimes memory can get so contextualized that in order to recall one piece of information, you need to go through everything else. So when you're alphabetizing something, do you run through like the alphabet song in your head to figure out where it is? It's because we're so used to that specific order that it can actually hinder more general, transferable, flexible learning.
Perhaps we should bring you in as a consultant, because some of our studies on mixed versus block practice haven't been nearly as uniformly successful as yours are. And
Yes,
as you know,
I would
I
love
play
to.
around with fairly complex materials like ECGs, and certainly
Yeah.
you picked the one study that really worked well, but subsequent studies
of them
didn't
don't.
really work that well.
I think it would be so interesting to figure out what the boundary conditions are. I think, especially with more complex material, we don't yet know.
Well,
have the
that's
answers.
the essence of the question I wanted to ask. It seems to me that I challenge you to suggest that there's a problem of external validity in your studies, in that whatever learning occurs is essentially incidental to the practice materials themselves. There is no, maybe this isn't wrong, because I mean you didn't go into detail, didn't have time to, but there isn't an instructional phase. I defy you to try and understand fluids and electrolytes without a ton of instruction before
Yeah.
you get there.
So I know that some of the math work, even the chemistry compound studies, they have included instructional phases. So I think when you're talking about much more complex things, it is important to have an instructional phase, but the practice of the sequence of the practice problems really need to be interleaved. If not at first, you may want to go from block to interleave. I definitely think that hybrid schedules for a large set of materials are going to be the way to go. It's not a question of blocking versus interleaving. It's going to be a problem of how do we know when would be the perfect time to introduce interleaving? And I think the general story that we're getting from the literature is a hell of a lot sooner than we think. Still want to consult or do studies with you.
So I have a very general question for you in some ways. I too work in a public education system, K to 12, work as a knowledge mobilization person in that field, and we've been spectacularly unsuccessful in getting this lesson out to the general public that learning is sometimes hard work. I mean, our teachers say, you know, that's just all drill and kill. It's going to shut off their creativity and put them all to sleep. Some of the best evidence-based programs like Jump Math aren't accepted. It's got good evidence that it's effective, and they aren't accepted in public education because people see that as a very repetitive drill-type program. How do we change that message so that we understand that, in fact, there is some necessary drill and some necessary practice for students to learn skills in mathematics and a whole number of other fields as well?
So first of all, with retrieval practice, I think there's a misconception for a lot of people that retrieval practice, maybe it's because the word testing was used for retrieval practice in the past. People have a misconception that retrieval practice is about drill and kill. But if I ask you what are your main takeaway messages from today's earlier talks, or if I ask you to, that's a retrieval event, but that's not a drill and kill retrieval, that's one where you actually have to make your own meaning. And so there's so much about these strategies that are good not just for memorizing things, but really, really good for synthesizing, reorganizing, etc. But with math, for example, you do need fluency in your times table to be able to do anything else. And I think that's an issue also of cognitive load. If you are trying to do, you know, differential calculus or whatever, you need to know what 2 means. And you need to know that 2 is smaller than 4. You need to have these basics so that it's not taking up room in your cognitive memory.
I understand all those parts, but I guess I was more asking you,
how do we convince people?
Why do you think we've been so unsuccessful in taking this knowledge out to education, the education field in general?
So why have we been so unsuccessful in spreading our data? I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. I think we have a lot of people here who are trying to do so to varying degrees of success. A lot of it's new. I think part of the problem is that a lot of research has happened in an isolated ivory tower sort of way, where there hasn't been, up until recently, more efforts to disseminate. I think from the social psychologists who've done motivation research, they've done a great job in disseminating. And I think as cognitive psychologists, maybe we need to do that better too.
Okay, thank you very much, Veronica.